It was an ordinary Wednesday morning in Chesterfield County, Virginia. The courthouse stood tall, a familiar building for residents who came here to pay fines, attend hearings, or resolve disputes. On most days, it was quiet, just a routine hub for legal business in a suburban town outside Richmond. But that morning, something felt different. Something unsettling. As residents walked by, they noticed unfamiliar vehicles parked near the sprawling Justice Complex. Dark SUVs, men in plainclothes standing close by, watching. And then came the whispers, "ICE is here." The news spread fast. Immigration and Customs Enforcement agents had been inside the courthouse for several days, detaining people who came for routine appearances. Some were there to pay a traffic ticket, others to face minor charges, but instead of walking out free, they were led away in handcuffs, transported to holding facilities, uncertain of what fate awaited them. At least 15 people had already been taken since the week began. For a quiet community like Chesterfield, it was shocking. This wasn't just about law enforcement anymore. This was about neighbors, families, people who shared classrooms, workplaces, and pews at Sunday service, and soon the residents decided they couldn't stay silent. By Wednesday morning, they began to gather. First a few, then dozens. Protesters stood on both sides of the courthouse, carrying signs, water bottles, and a single bullhorn that echoed through the air. El pueblo unido jamás será vencido. The people united will never be defeated. The chant cut through the tension like a blade. On one side, faith leaders and activists spoke to the small crowd, warning of what this meant for justice. On the other, ordinary neighbors stood shoulder to shoulder, watching federal agents with narrowed eyes. This wasn't just about immigration anymore. It was about trust, the trust a community places in its justice system, the trust neighbors place in each other, and the fear that maybe, just maybe, no one was safe. And then something happened that turned the protests from chants into outrage. A man, an ordinary Chesterfield resident, had come to the courthouse that morning to do something simple, to pay a fine. Nothing more. But before he could leave, ICE agents surrounded him. And just like that, in front of everyone, he was taken away. The crowd gasped. Some shouted. Others began recording on their phones. If it could happen to him, they thought, who would be next? The courthouse steps had never seen a scene like this before, where usually there were lawyers shuffling papers and families waiting nervously for their names to be called. Now there were voices raised, chants echoing against the concrete walls on one side of the building. A small group of activists had planted themselves near the transport area, where those detained by ICE were believed to be held before being moved out of Chesterfield. They came armed not with weapons but with water, signs, and a bullhorn that magnified their defiance. El pueblo unido jamás será vencido. The people united will never be defeated. The phrase thundered through the summer air, rolling across the parking lot, rattling the windows of offices inside. To some, it sounded like hope. To others, it sounded like rebellion. Across the complex, another group had formed. This one was quieter, more measured. Faith leaders in long robes stood alongside community organizers and local activists, holding banners that read, "Justice for all and courts are for fairness, not fear." Nicole Martin, the president of the Chesterfield County NAACP, stepped forward to address the crowd. Her voice was firm, echoing the frustration of so many who felt the courthouse, a symbol of fairness and due process, had been hijacked. When ICE conducts raids in courthouses, she declared, we do more than just disrupt legal proceedings. We undermine the very foundation of due process itself, a principle enshrined in our Constitution. Every person deserves fair treatment under the law. That principle is not optional. It is not negotiable, the crowd applauded. Some cheered. A few wiped away tears. Standing just behind her was Chesterfield County Clerk Amanda Pohl, a woman not known for political speeches, but who now found herself at the center of a storm she hadn't asked for. She lifted the microphone with shaking hands and spoke not as a politician, but as a neighbor. "We are committed to serving every member of the public," she said, "regardless of immigration status. We do not inquire about status. We do not report to ICE. Our job is to serve this community, all of it, with professionalism and confidentiality." Her words carried weight. People knew her. She was someone they trusted to keep records, not to make speeches. And that made her message even more powerful. But it wasn't just activists and clerks who were concerned. Even Sheriff Carl Leonard, a man not easily shaken, told reporters he feared victims of crimes would stop coming forward. Witnesses might refuse to appear in court, terrified they too might be taken away. Victims will have their justice denied, Leonard warned. Gravely? And criminals will walk free not because they were innocent, but because the people who could put them away were too afraid to step into this building. The courthouse, once a symbol of order, had become a battlefield of words and principles. And then, right in the middle of the protests, something happened that no one could ignore. A man, middle-aged and unassuming, walked up the courthouse steps. He wasn't there for politics. He wasn't there to protest. He was simply there to pay a fine, a ticket for running a stoplight. He thought it would take 10 minutes at most. But the agents had been watching. Before he could leave, ICE officers moved in swiftly. Within seconds, the man was surrounded. His papers were checked. His wrists were restrained. The quiet transaction he expected had turned into a public arrest. The protesters erupted. Shouts filled the air. Shame! Let him go! This is not justice! Phones rose into the air as people recorded, capturing every second of the arrest. Some tried to get closer, but officers blocked their way. Others cried openly, realizing how fragile safety now felt in their own neighborhood. It was no longer just headlines. No longer just rumors. Now everyone could see it. The courthouse had become a hunting ground. As the man in the courthouse lobby was led away by ICE agents, the crowd outside grew restless. Protesters pressed against the barriers, their voices rising, their chants sharper than before. Among them was Maria Sanchez, a local mother of 3 who had lived in Chesterfield for more than a decade. She clutched a homemade sign that read, "Families belong together." Her voice cracked as she shouted, but her determination never wavered. "He came here for a traffic ticket," Maria cried. "If they can take him, they can take any of us." Beside her stood David Harper, a retired postal worker who wasn't there for immigration politics. He had come because he believed the courthouse was meant for justice, not fear. "I worked 40 years in this town," Harper muttered to a reporter. "Nearby, I know my neighbors. They pay taxes, they raise kids, and they go to church. And now they're afraid to step foot in the courthouse? That's not the Chesterfield I know." Inside the courthouse, the atmosphere was tense. Court clerks whispered nervously to each other. Some avoided eye contact with the ICE agents stationed in the hallways. Others quietly reached for their phones, messaging loved ones. "Be careful if you come today. ICE is here." By noon, the protests had doubled in size. College students from Richmond arrived with banners. A local pastor, Reverend James Colton, carried a megaphone and prayed aloud for those detained. Faith leaders stood shoulder to shoulder with activists, repeating one line again and again. "Our courts are not battlefields. Our neighbors are not criminals?" But fear spreads faster than hope. At a nearby cafe, residents whispered over coffee cups. Some argued that ICE was simply doing its job, enforcing the law. Others shook their heads, insisting this was different. This wasn't law and order. This was intimidation. And in neighborhoods across Chesterfield, a quieter fear took root. Parents told their children to stay indoors. Workers debated whether to show up at their jobs the next day. Even those who weren't directly affected felt the unease because the courthouse was supposed to be neutral ground. That evening, in a small brick house just a few blocks away, Maria sat with her children. She tried to reassure them, telling them everything would be okay. But outside, the sound of distant chants still carried through the night air, and her youngest son, only 9 years old, asked a question she couldn't answer. "Mama, if they can take people from the courthouse, can they come here too?" Maria hugged him tightly, but her silence spoke louder than any words. The second day, Chesterfield was no longer just a courthouse protest. It had become a community-wide argument. On Main Street, small business owners stood in their doorways, watching as groups of protesters passed with banners and bullhorns. Some nodded in quiet approval, grateful that people were standing up. Others folded their arms and frowned, whispering to each other about law and order and outsiders causing trouble. One of them, Tom Jenkins, a lifelong resident and owner of a hardware store, didn't hide his feelings. "Look," he told a local news crew, "if you're here illegally, you broke the law. ICE is doing its job. That's not oppression. That's enforcement. People need to stop acting like criminals are victims." His words spread quickly, and not everyone agreed. Down the street, Angela Rivera, a teacher at Chesterfield Middle School, gathered with a group of parents outside the playground. She shook her head as she heard Jenkins' comments replayed on someone's phone. "Do you know what's happening in my classroom?" she asked the parents. "Kids are crying because they don't know if their moms will be home when they get off the bus. How do you call that justice?" The split was everywhere. In churches, pastors debated whether to take a public stand. At grocery stores, strangers argued in the checkout lines. On Facebook, neighbors who once shared recipes and yard sale ads now exchanged bitter accusations. "If you support the raids, you don't have a heart. If you oppose them, you don't respect the law." The courthouse itself had become a stage for this divide. Protesters chanted for justice, while counter-protesters arrived waving American flags, chanting "Follow the law or go home." It wasn't just politics anymore. It was neighbor versus neighbor. That afternoon, tensions boiled over when Tom Jenkins himself showed up at the courthouse steps. Holding a small sign that read a law, he confronted the protesters directly. "You're defending criminals," he shouted. "Every one of you is spitting on the law of this country." Maria Sanchez, the mother of 3 who had been there since the first day, turned toward him. Her voice trembled but carried across the crowd. "And you're defending fear," she said. "What kind of law takes fathers from their children for a traffic ticket?" The crowd erupted, half cheering, half jeering. Shouts filled the air. "Go home, Maria. Shame on you, Tom." Police officers moved in to form a line between the groups, their hands resting uneasily on their belts. For a moment, it seemed the courthouse steps might erupt into violence, but instead of fists, the battle was fought with words, bitter, sharp, and unforgettable. That night, Chesterfield wasn't just a town anymore. It was 2 towns, one convinced ICE was protecting them. The other convinced ICE was tearing them apart, and in the middle were the families who didn't know if tomorrow they would still be together by the 3rd morning. Chesterfield County Courthouse no longer looked like a place of law. It looked like a battleground. Satellite trucks from Richmond and Washington lined the street, their antennas towering above the crowd. Reporters with microphones dodged between protesters, asking questions, recording chants, and broadcasting. Live updates. The courthouse lawn, once trimmed and quiet, was now littered with signs. "No justice in fear. Courts are for people, not raids, and stop ICE terror." Across from them stood counter-protesters, smaller in number but louder in defiance, their flags waving and their voices booming. "USA! USA!" The chants collided in the summer air, each side trying to drown the other out. Sheriff deputies stood between the 2 groups, sweat glistening under their hats. Their eyes scanned nervously, watching for any spark that could ignite chaos. Nicole Martin of the NAACP returned, this time with more force in her voice. Cameras captured her every word. "This courthouse belongs to the people of Chesterfield," she said firmly, "not to federal agents turning it into a trap. When a man comes to pay a traffic ticket and instead is hauled away, that is not justice, that is fear, and we will not stand for it." Applause and cheers followed, echoing across the courthouse steps. Moments later, Tom Jenkins, the hardware store owner, stepped forward again, this time holding his Bible in one hand and his sign in the other. His voice thundered across the lawn. "Obeying the law is not fear. God commands us to follow order, not chaos. If you want safety in this neighborhood, you must start by respecting the law of the land." Boos erupted from the protesters. A plastic water bottle flew across the crowd, narrowly missing Jenkins. Deputies rushed to push the groups apart. The line between words and violence had thinned to a thread, and then, as if the day weren't already tense enough, it happened again. Around noon, a young man named Luis Ortega walked into the courthouse. He had lived in Chesterfield for years, working odd jobs, paying rent, rarely drawing attention. That day, he came only to deliver paperwork for a minor traffic infraction, but the ICE agents had been watching. Just like before, Before Lys could leave, they stepped forward. His hands trembled as they asked for identification. His papers weren't in order. Within moments, he was restrained. The crowd outside saw it unfold through the glass doors. Gasps turned to cries. Cameras zoomed in, catching every second. Maria Sanchez screamed, rushing forward until deputies held her back. "That's my neighbor," she cried. "He mowed my lawn last summer. He helped fix my car. He's not a criminal, he's part of this town." Her voice cracked with desperation, and the cameras captured her tears. Within minutes, the footage spread online. Headlines flashed across phones and TV screens. "IC arrests man in Chesterfield." "Courthouse as protests erupt community in." "Chaos. Neighbors face off over immigration raids." "Caught on camera. Another courthouse." "Detention sparks outrage." The courthouse was no longer just local news. It was national. That night, Chesterfield felt different. Streets that were usually filled with laughter and porch lights glowed dimmer, quieter. Families locked their doors earlier than usual. Neighbors avoided eye contact. At Maria's house, her children refused to sleep. They whispered questions. She couldn't answer. At Tom Jenkins' hardware store, graffiti had appeared on the brick wall. "Shame." And in the middle of it all, the courthouse loomed in silence, guarded by deputies even after midnight. Its steps scarred by the voices and clashes of the day. Chesterfield wasn't the same town anymore. It wasn't just divided, it was wounded. The courthouse stood heavy under the weight of silence. But that silence didn't last long. By the fourth day, Chesterfield had turned into a stage no one asked for, a small town now flashing across TV screens nationwide. Vans from CNN, Fox News, and local Richmond outlets lined the streets. Reporters jostled for position, their cameras ready, their eyes searching for drama. The protesters gave them more than they needed. On one side, Maria Sanchez gripped her microphone, her voice raw from days of shouting but her spirit unbroken. "This courthouse is supposed to protect us, but now it betrays us. When neighbors vanish for paying traffic tickets, justice no longer lives here." The crowd cheered, raising their fists in unison. On the other side, Tom Jenkins returned once again, stubborn, immovable, his Bible still tucked under his arm. "Without the rule of law, this town will drown in chaos," he thundered. "I have lived here for 30 years. I've seen our streets change. Families are afraid to walk at night. If ICE is what it takes to restore order, then so be it." Banners rose, voices collided. Deputies pushed back as chants of "shame" and "USA" clashed like thunder rolling through narrow streets. Sheriff Carl Leonard stood at the courthouse doors, sweat dripping down his face. He spoke to reporters, his voice low but urgent. "We can't keep order like this for long. Victims won't report crimes. Witnesses won't come to court. And these protests, they're tearing neighbors apart." Behind him, deputies locked the courthouse gates. The building that once symbolized safety now looked like a fortress. Among the protesters was Rosa Alvarez, a quiet woman in her 60s who had lived in Chesterfield since the early 90s. She stood trembling before the cameras, clutching a photograph of her late husband. "He died in this town. We built our lives here. I raised my children here. But now they look at us like strangers. My granddaughter asked me if ICE will take me away. How do I tell her I don't know?" Tears rolled down her cheeks, and even some counter-protesters lowered their signs, looking away. But the moment of quiet compassion didn't last. At noon, the courthouse doors burst open once again. Luis Ortega, the man detained the day before, was being transported. His wrists were bound, his face pale, his eyes scanning the crowd one last time. Maria screamed, "Luis, we're with you!" The crowd surged forward, desperate, angry, helpless. Deputies raised their arms, forming a wall. Protesters shouted, shoved, and cried. A plastic bottle struck the side of the transport van. Cameras caught every angle, every scream, every tear. In that instant, Chesterfield wasn't just a Virginia suburb anymore. It was the face of a national debate, raw, divided, unhealed. As the sun dipped low and the crowd thinned, a lone reporter stood before the courthouse steps, microphone in hand. His words carried over the footage of flashing lights, weary deputies, and protesters clutching their fading signs. What began as a quiet courthouse in Chesterfield has become the center of a storm, one that has divided neighbors, tested friendships, and raised questions about justice, safety, and belonging. For some, this is about law and order. For others, it's about humanity and fear. Tonight, Chesterfield County stands at a crossroads, unsure which path it will take. But one thing is certain: this community will never see this courthouse the same way again. The camera panned wide, capturing the courthouse bathed in the glow of sirens and streetlights. The story ended, but the echoes remained. The courthouse was quiet again, but the silence wasn't peace. It was exhausting. By the following morning, Chesterfield residents woke up to find their small town splashed across national headlines. ICE arrests spark outrage in Virginia courthouse, protests grow in Chesterfield. Neighbors versus neighbors: is justice at risk when immigration raids happen in courtrooms? Cable networks replayed the same footage, Maria screaming for Luis, deputies locking arms, Tom Jenkins waving his Bible. Over and over, the images ran until Chesterfield no longer felt like Chesterfield. It felt like the epicenter of something far bigger, inside the neighborhoods in the Willow Creek subdivision. Maria returned home. Her neighbors watched her quietly. Some waved in solidarity. Others pulled their curtains shut. Her daughter, Elena, clung to her. "Mom, the kids at school keep asking if we're next. They laugh. They say ICE will take us." Maria swallowed hard, forcing a smile she didn't feel. "We are strong. Don't let them see you afraid." Across town, Tom Jenkins sat at his kitchen table, his Bible open but his hands restless. His wife looked at him and whispered, "Tom, maybe you went too far." Maybe shouting at that woman wasn't the answer, but Tom shook his head. No, someone has to defend the law. If not me, then who? Even within his own family, the debate was alive, unresolved, painful, splitting households apart. Media frenzy. By the weekend, satellite trucks camped outside Chesterfield like vultures circling. Reporters knocked on doors, chasing quotes. Anchors debated on primetime. Was ICE right to enforce the law inside courthouses? Or had they poisoned the very system meant to deliver justice? Pundits from Washington weighed in, their voices detached, polished, distant. But for the people of Chesterfield, the wounds were real and raw. Clerk Amanda Pohl stared at her desk piled with papers. But it wasn't the documents that weighed her down. It was the faces. Faces of families too afraid to walk inside. Faces of witnesses who vanished, unwilling to risk ICE waiting in the halls. She whispered to a colleague, "How can we uphold justice when the people who need it most won't even step through the door?" Her words hung in the air, unanswered. A nation watching Chesterfield's story became a symbol. In immigrant communities across the country, whispers grew louder. "Don't go to court. Don't risk it. Stay hidden." And in neighborhoods across America, the other side echoed, "If you break the law, you pay the price." Two visions of America, colliding, unresolved. And Chesterfield had become the battlefield. By Sunday evening, news broke that Luis Ortega was being processed for deportation. Maria sat in her kitchen, staring at her phone, tears sliding silently down her cheeks. She whispered to her daughter, "He came here for a better life. All he did was drive through a stoplight, and now he's gone." Her daughter's voice cracked. "Is this what it means to be American? To lose everything over nothing?" Maria had no answer. That night, standing under the dim glow of courthouse lights, the same reporter closed another segment. Chesterfield County may be a small dot on the map, but tonight it carries the weight of a national struggle. For some, it's a fight for safety and order. For others, it's about dignity and survival. What happens here may soon shape how America defines justice itself. From Chesterfield, this is James Walker reporting. The camera pulled back, revealing an empty courthouse, a lone flag swaying against the night sky, a quiet town, a broken trust. A story far from over. The protests faded. The cameras rolled away. But Chesterfield was never the same again. A divided community in the Willow Creek neighborhood. Lawn signs started popping up. Immigrants welcome here. Protect our borders. Neighbors who once shared backyard. Barbecues now avoided eye contact. Friendly waves at mailboxes turned into stiff nods or silence. Mrs. Alvarez stopped walking her dog past Tom Jenkins' house, afraid of his glare. Tom's wife no longer attended community luncheons, ashamed of the whispers behind her back. Even children felt the fracture. At Chesterfield Elementary, playground arguments erupted. "Your dad's illegal. ICE will get him. You don't know anything. My mom says everyone belongs." The innocence of childhood was gone, replaced by the bitterness of adults. Clerk Amanda Pohl fought hard to reassure residents. "Our courthouse is for justice, not fear." But her words often fell flat. Attendance at hearings plummeted. Witnesses disappeared. Victims stopped reporting crimes. A single raid had planted a seed of mistrust that grew into a forest of silence. And in that silence, justice struggled to survive. Months later, Chesterfield was still mentioned on talk shows, referenced in debates, cited in policy arguments. For politicians, it became a symbol. For activists, it became a rallying cry. But for the people who lived there, it was just home, fractured, raw, uncertain. Maria Ortega never saw her brother Luis again. She tried writing, calling, sending money to the detention center where he waited, but the distance grew too heavy. Her daughter Elena stopped asking about him. Instead, she focused on her studies. Quietly determined to prove that their family still had a place in America, Tom Jenkins kept attending church, still defending his stance. But late at night, when the house was quiet, he wondered, had he protected his country or just torn apart his town? Amanda Pohl stayed at her desk, pushing paperwork, her heart heavy. She had chosen her job to serve justice. Now, she wondered if justice still lived inside those walls, under the dim courthouse lights. The same reporter returned for one last segment. His voice was calm, but heavy with truth. What happened here in Chesterfield was more than a single protest. It was a mirror that showed us the two faces of America, one calling for order, the other crying for compassion. Neighbors stood side by side, yet worlds apart. And though the cameras may leave, the scars will remain. The question that lingers is simple. When justice and fear collide, which one do we let win? From Chesterfield County, this is James Walker reporting. The camera lingered on the courthouse steps, empty now, but still echoing with the chants of a divided community. The people united will never be defeated, and then silence.
This was just one story, but the next one will be even more dramatic. Are you ready? Then you need to subscribe to HOA Stories 87 right now. Like this video, share it with your friends, and hit the bell because the next story might sound a little too close to home.